Hello and welcome to this webinar on dispute resolution under the Code of Conduct for Australian wine grape purchasers. This is the first of a series of webinars aimed at assisting parties to understand the process of resolving disputes relating to grape supply agreements. In the next webinar, we will provide an introduction to assessing the validity of testing and sampling protocols for wine grape quality assessment against industry guidelines. The information contained in the presentation is intended to be a guide for independent experts, conciliators, and growers and winemakers whose agreements are governed by the Code. So we'll start with a bit about the Code. The Code was developed by a Code Management Committee made up of equal numbers of winemakers and grape growers, and it's basically a set of rules to ensure that agreements and expectations are aligned. It is wineries that sign the Code, not growers, and by doing so, they are effectively incorporating the provisions in the Code into their contracts, which I'll refer to from now on as grower supply agreements. So unless a variation has been mutually agreed to under 3.4 negotiated alternative arrangements, all provisions in the Code will become part of the grape supply agreement. Being voluntary, it's not designed to be an encumbrance on signatories, but rather to foster long-term improvements in relationships and to enhance business-to-business culture. One of the big benefits of signing the Code is that the opportunity to make use of the dispute resolution process. And in this presentation, I'll outline how this operates. So here we go. Before commencing a formal dispute resolution, it's important that senior representatives from each party, i.e. the grape grower and the winery, attempt first to resolve the dispute by discussion and negotiation in good faith. If this has not been able to lead to a resolution, you can find the process that should be followed on our website, and I'm about to run through that. So www.agw.org.au, and the page attached shows you where you can find it. So the process essentially starts by getting in contact with the Code Secretariat. And this is a fully independent organisation appointed by a Code committee. And the contact details of the Secretariat are also available on our website. When you contact the Secretariat, they'll have a chat with both parties and ensure that they're not able to resolve the dispute. And then they'll assist with the appointment of either an independent expert or a conciliator. And this is a process to help to try to resolve the dispute. And I'll talk about the role of the conciliators and the independent experts over the next few slides. So we now, under the amended Code, there are now 3 types of disputes that have been categorised, and the Secretariat will help to direct the dispute down one of these 3 pathways based on information provided to the Secretariat by the complainant, i.e. the grower. So pricing disputes and quality assessment disputes are resolved by a process of independent determination, and this process has some similarities with arbitration in that the parties agree that the final decision is binding, and failure to comply with the determination actually amounts to a breach of the requirements of Code signatories. Now, the 3rd type of dispute is where there's an issue with the agreement and it's not related to price or quality assessment, and this type of dispute will be directed towards a conciliation process. This is not dissimilar to mediation, and the conciliator will make a recommendation. However, the Secretariat maintains a list of people who are suitably qualified to fulfil each of these roles. Where there's a dispute over whether an agreement has been breached, or if it is inconsistent with the Code and it's not related to a fair market price assessment or a quality assessment, it's more likely that a conciliation will occur in accordance with the procedures that are laid out in Appendix 2 of the Code. So examples of disputes that might be directed towards conciliation are when the parties disagree on the interpretation of the terms of the agreement, where there is insufficient clarity regarding how price or quality will be determined, or even the very existence of the contract in the first place. So the role of the conciliator is purely advisory but not determinative. So unlike an independent determination, parties are not bound to any advice provided, and for this reason not all conciliations will generate a mutually agreed outcome. Now, the Code doesn't dictate what must happen if a conciliation does happen to fail. However, there may be provisions in the agreement itself that outline that. So If a complainant is not satisfied with an outcome, this should be referred to the Code Secretariat in writing, who will refer the matter to the Code Management Committee to make a recommendation on any further action. The other types of disputes are a process of independent determination conducted by experts who are either engaged to make a technical assessment or a price assessment. Generally, a technical expert is someone with expertise in assessing wine grapes, usually someone with qualifications in viticulture, for example. A technical expert is not required to make any comments regarding price, but rather to comment on whether the grapes have been assessed correctly and in accordance with any specifications that have been documented in the grower-supply agreement. A pricing expert is someone who understands the market, and they'll need to look at ways of acquiring information regarding the market in the given region for the given variety, and potentially also the given grade, assuming a grade has been agreed upon already and is not the subject of dispute. The role of the independent pricing expert, as described within the code, is to determine whether the price for the grapes has been properly determined in accordance with the pricing mechanism outlined in the agreement. Pricing mechanisms allowed under the code include a fixed price, a base price, a grade price, a fair market price, a weighted district average price, or any other pricing formula that can be calculated objectively. Fixed price, base price, or grade price contracts are unlikely to be the subject of a price dispute, unless the quality assessment is in question relating to the grade, in which case it's a technical expert that would be required in preference to an independent pricing expert. Weighted district average price contracts or calculated price contracts tend to be more objective, so it's less common for these mechanisms to be subject to question. Therefore, an independent expert will primarily be required to make a determination relating to fair market price contracts. Now, fair market price assessments are rarely black and white by the nature of what they are. So when entering into this type of agreement, both parties are effectively putting their fate into the hands of the independent pricing expert. Nevertheless, it's common to have these types of agreements, and therefore we have this independent process for resolving any issues that might arise. The independent pricing expert will need to familiarise themselves with the code as well as any other provisions relating to price. For example, signatories must not purchase grapes on the basis of a pricing formula that gives the winemaker the opportunity to substantially influence the price payable to the grower. And also note that there are only limited circumstances where price deductions or rejections should be imposed. If it is unclear as to whether the agreement clearly outlines the pricing mechanism in accordance with the provisions contained within the code, then a conciliation should be pursued in preference to an independent expert determination. When an independent pricing expert is required to make a determination that relates to a fair market price contract, they will use their expert knowledge of the market at that time and taking into consideration the variety, the region, and any other relevant factors that might come into play in that season. In doing so, they may seek confidential information from other buyers of equivalent grapes. They may also consider past trends and current export prices. Sometimes there may be insufficient information available to determine a fair market price. And in this case, a final determination might be that the price will be adjusted subject to the release of the National Vintage Report, which comes out from Wine Australia typically around July. The role of an independent technical expert is to determine whether the grapes have been assessed according to the specifications contained within the agreement. So this is different to a pricing expert and requires a different set of skills and expertise. So this person will assess whether the grapes have been, whether the analytical processes for determining maturity, specifications, purity, and also condition standards have been met. They may be engaged also to undertake an objective technical assessment at the vineyard prior to harvest or at the winery, and they may need to make use of evidence that has been retained as required under the code. For more information, there are webinars which will be updated and expanded upon in time that follow this episode. And as we refine the procedures, these will be developed and improved upon over time with the aim of being as objective as possible and incorporating any new science relating to the best practice methods for assessing grapes. So both the independent technical expert and the signatory to the code should understand their requirements in terms of assessment by watching this next set of videos, which will touch a little bit on industry endorsed standard procedures that have to be used by code signatories. So for the purpose of this video, I'm just going to provide a very brief overview. So under the code, as code signatories, the winemaker must document any maturity, purity and condition standards that the grapes will be assessed against, and any parameters or benchmarks which grading will be undertaken, and any other specifications that will be used to make price deductions or rejections. So in making their assessment, they may collect evidence such as digital images of the sample or the grape bins, for instance, retention samples, potentially like frozen juice samples, and also documented records demonstrating compliance with analytical procedures or sampling procedures. When assessing grapes against maturity, purity and condition standards, or grading them or making any assessment of grapes, signatories must avoid the use of subjective measures to determine price in circumstances where there are credible objective measures readily available to measure the same or similar characteristics. And as I said before, where they exist, they must use the industry endorsed standard procedure and clearly document their methodology and results and retain that documentation. So independent technical experts should also familiarise themselves with Section 5 of the code, which talks about quality assessment, and keep in mind that unless the grapes have failed to meet maturity, purity and condition standards or agreed specifications or terms that are documented in the grower supply agreement, price deductions must not be imposed and grapes must not be rejected. Finally, if the issue relates to whether the contract itself complies with the requirements under the code, then it's not a job for a technical expert. So if it's a contractual issue, and therefore it would be directed down the path of conciliation. So it's not a requirement, and nor is it appropriate for the technical expert to comment on the market price, and any reference to price should only apply to what is spelled out in the contract already. If the contract does not assign a price to a grade, for instance, but says it will pay the fair market price for that particular grade, then this dispute should go down the price of a pricing expert if it's about price. It may fall upon the independent expert to recognise that the dispute has gone down the wrong pathway. And it's also really important for the complainant or the grower to make sure that they're clear so that it goes down the right path. So this page just shows where you can find all the resources that I've talked about. And there's also an excerpt from the code about wine grape quality assessment there, which you can look up by downloading the code from our website. And there's a whole section on the site with resources under wine grape quality assessments. Particularly, it has the standard procedures, which is the industry endorsed standard procedures that we call IESPs, and they're referenced in the code. And it also has guidelines for other types of analysis as to what best practice is to help people make sure that they're analysing their grapes or their wine in the best possible way. For this process to work at its best, it needs to be made clear to the Secretariat what the complaint is about. In other words, whether it's about the grading process or the price itself that they disagree with. If the dispute relates to both price and quality, you would technically need two separate determinations. So it's best if the grower can, if you happen to be the grower, that you can really isolate what is the issue. If it's an issue with the agreement itself not being clear, then it would go to conciliation. And similarly, the independent expert needs to be clear about the limitations of their role. And there's further information about what should be reported in the final determination available on request. Both parties in a dispute resolution procedure should assist the independent expert or the conciliator by providing any information requested of them. And bear in mind that any confidential information of parties to a dispute obtained by the Secretariat or the committee must and will be kept confidential, and that's documented in the code 6.5 of the code. And finally, growers should always be made to feel comfortable that by making a complaint it will not lead to any retaliatory action against the grower by the signatory. So this brings me to the end of the first webinar, and I'll finish by saying that we wish you all the best in your contractual relationships and hope that any issues are resolved with limited costs to either party. And please don't hesitate to contact me direct if you have any questions, and my email address is there on the screen.